Good afternoon, everyone. Nearly said good morning. Hello, I'm Felicity March, and I'm known as Flick. I'm the Resilience and Security Director for IBM, but I'm more known for my passion around operational resilience and making sure companies can maintain core purpose and integrity under duress. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon with, wow, what a cast of panelists we've got. So there should be some really interactive debate. And I know that we've got differing opinions and different views on how we can make sure that companies continue to function with all the things that are happening, pandemic and cyber attacks, and all the things that we haven't planned for that usually hit us on a Tuesday lunchtime. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. In no fixed order, I'll start with you, Simon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Simon Langley. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Conveyor Insurance. I'm responsible for information security and risk. A lot of my career has been spent as I've been Big Four consulting, where I was largely in the security business. My job was Horace's, but also for a couple of years, head of business.
Lovely, Simon. I think we're slightly losing you, but I've certainly got the gist of your experience. So, Dan, over to you, my friend.
Hi, yeah, I'm Dan Burns. I'm head of cybersecurity operations at Next. Been with Next for about 14 years now, so a very long time. Started my career in infrastructure as an engineer, and have been heading up the security operations at Next for about 4.5 years now. So responsible for the incident response, vulnerability management, security engineering, all of the operational functions. Wow,
fantastic job. You must be having lots of fun at the moment. So thank you, Dan.
Not too much.
Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Flick. Yeah, so I'm Lee Howard. I am currently the head of IT security and risk for M Brown Group. M Brown Group is an online digital retailer. Several brands under the umbrella. Some you may be more familiar with: JD Williams, Simply Be, Giacomo. We're also a lender, which makes the dynamics of my job all the more interesting, and certainly operational resilience all the more applicable. Prior to that, I had a career for the best part of a decade within the defence sector, some of it actually in green, and some of it contracting with technology companies such as HP and Technologies.
Perfect, thank you, Lee. And last but very not least, Raj.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Raj Simani. I'm a McAfee Fellow and Chief Scientist. I run the Advanced Threat Research Division and Threat Intelligence teams here at the company. I also work as Special Advisor to the European Cybercrime Centre, and I'm no stranger to operational resilience. And I also co-founded the No More Ransom initiative, which has prevented about $800 million from going into the hands of criminals.
Perfect, fantastic, Raj. So thank you all very much indeed, and I know it's going to be a great session. We find that actually disaster recovery in history and resilience and backup is in one very significant place in IT, and security usually is in a very different place. But of course, when companies have destructive cyber attacks or outages, it is no longer enough for companies to say, well, we'll just wait until the IT team have recovered it, because destructive cyber attacks can literally take you down to your bones and beyond. And that is why it's very important that we look at how we make sure companies can maintain core purpose and integrity. The reason it is important is for those of you that are roughly my age, and some of you are looking significantly younger, but in the 90s, Gartner towered us. And they basically towered us into mainframe, mid-range, server, end user, desktop, network, applications, database. We all know and love these towers because, of course, we're still sitting in them 30 years later. So we know how to bring up a server. We know how to bring up a data center. We even know how to restore an app. But when I walk into companies and say, what do you need to recover? Dan, you'll say to me, I need my retail website up and running in 5 minutes. Next will say, I need to have access, or my clients to have access to money. And a hospital will say, I need you to make sure I have access to patient records. They don't say it's a server or a cloud environment or an app. So the thing is, what happens is when you start speaking to CIOs and they understand their critical processes, when you say what technology, people and processes you're reliant on for that one business process, the answer typically, there are some fantastic shining lights, especially on this call, but typically we find the CIO or the IT team say, I know I've got 45,000 PCs and I know I've got 6,000 servers and I know I've got 2,500 apps, but I don't know which ones I'm reliant on for my critical business processes. So when you then unpeel the layer again, you then find that those SLAs are not sufficient to meet the business risk appetite. So Dan, you and I know you're very passionate about this subject. So what do you think about it, and what's your views on this kind of resilience attitude?
I think it's more important than ever. You know, I think we've reached the age now where we recognise that we all have to be breach ready. You know, gone are the days when we believe that our perimeter would hold and we'll be all right. It won't be us. We're all very much waiting for that day when it will be our turn. And so, you know, the idea of resilience is more important than ever. And I really like the word as well, because I think it's such a tough question when someone on your board asks you, how secure are we? That's such an impossible question for a security practitioner to answer. When you turn that question into how resilient are we, that's something I think you can talk about, you can discuss, and you can, you know, have a real understanding of where do we really stand. You know, if the worst were to happen, what might that look like for us? So I think it's so important, and it's about, to the point you made, linking all of those towers together and an understanding that when that does happen, we all have to work together to keep the business going.
Without a doubt, it's, you know, how quickly can you recover that process?
Yeah,
that's all they want to know. And actually the answer, of course, in traditional ways is I don't know, which is why, of course, resilience has fundamentally changed. So thank you, Dan. Lee, what's your view of this?
Yeah, I think I concur a lot with Dan. The questions we get asked from us as a security professional by the board is often you want a binary: are we safe or are we not safe? And it's not quite as binary as that. And I think it really lends itself to, as Dan was saying, you know, we're moving into, as data breaches increase exponentially around the world, as technologies for cyber criminals become more sophisticated and more prevalent, the likelihood of this happening or something significant to a business happening is ever increasing. So therefore, it is definitely a behavioural and cultural mindset change that needs to be happening within the business, in terms of it's not the if it will happen, but it will when it will happen. And it's actually training ourselves to become comfortable with that, because of the resilience we've baked in, because we've tested those controls, that if it does happen, we're actually content that we will be able to recover sufficiently, and the impact will not be as significant as we may fear. So I definitely,
no, you're absolutely
definitely a behaviour and cultural mindset change that needs to be happening from the top down in terms of resilience.
And do you know, it's amazing the amount of people say to me, I don't need resilience, I've got a third copy, I'm active, I've got high availability. And I say, well, you know, you've got to cyber social distance your data, if you don't mind me stealing a COVID-19 phrase, because otherwise you're going to basically bounce back up, and then you find that, well, you either find your attacks and you've gone down, and you either turn around to the IT team that go, oh no, I didn't do that kind of backup, that's the cyber team, they should fix it surely. Or they say, yeah, I'll try and restore it. And of course, they can't restore it because it's so infected. Or they do restore it. And then, of course, you've got mean time to investigate, mean time to respond or repair before you can even keep the business functioning. And of course, companies are now saying, you know, I'm making millions a day. IT goes down, revenue stops. So, yeah, it's important to think about how do we keep you up, but how do we keep you up cleanly without of course, the virus infecting you. So, Raj, you've definitely got a serious point of view on this. So what do you think about it all, with cyber and cyber resilience coming to the fore?
So if I'm brutally honest, you know, when we came across, certainly when I started to hear resilience becoming a topic within the cyber realm, I kind of disregarded it. You know, we're all used to these terms like, you know, resilience or single sign-on and all of these kind of long-term objectives, but what does it actually mean? And you know, I know actually when we spoke a few weeks back, you came up with this concept of the minimum viable company. And if we start to scratch beneath the surface, and really, like, if I'm attending this webinar, the thing that I want people to walk away from is, this is about taking cybersecurity and making it part of the business. Like, that's fundamentally the issue. I mean, I used to be a CISO, and I wouldn't say I wouldn't become a CISO again, but it is a very difficult and challenging job. It is this one C-level position that's not invited to the Christmas parties. It's the one position where there's a breach, you're the one to blame, regardless of whether you raised it as an issue or not. It's seen as a technology issue until it's not. And I think what I'm seeing, and certainly the discussions we're getting with regards to resilience, is you're making, and this is a cybersecurity issue, it's more than a cybersecurity issue, but you're taking the security component and you're really plugging it into the heart of what the business is and what the heart of business does. And I've been on so many investigations where in the middle of a breach, somebody turns around and goes, well, what was that server for? And if you're asking that question in the middle of the breach, it's too late. I think
it's too late, yeah.
And so why I think this topic is really important, for me, this is, and I don't want to oversell this is the future direction of the CISO.
Do you know, it's really interesting you say about CISO not being part of the business. I had a virtual cup of coffee with Andy Jones last week, and wonderful chap. He was the CISO at Maersk when it all happened. And he said exactly the same thing. I wasn't really at the board, but I also wasn't working with the business. And he said, and trying to get into the business was nearly impossible. But of course, he was the one that had to go to the White House to do the briefing. So he's the one that took the rap and had to explain why it all happened. But actually, yeah, it is the future of the CISO or future of the chief resilience officer, Raj. Completely agree, but we're all converging. Instead of backup and DR and cyber, it's now data protection and platform recovery and application recovery, and also making sure that that company continues to function under duress and under attack. So yeah, interesting. It's a massive paradigm shift as well. So let's hope that the CISO suddenly starts being taken very seriously. And final comments, Simon, what do you think about all of this and minimum company, and how do we keep businesses functioning no matter what?
It's been really interesting to see how the IT world has changed over the last 10 years. If I am, as you say, I'm in my 50s. I remember when I first started my career, the IT director was pretty much in charge of every aspect of IT because it was all done in-house. Yeah. That's not true anymore. We rely, as an organisation, like most organisations, rely very heavily on third parties. Our perimeter is not the walled garden that it used to be. It's absolutely full of holes. We have connections in and out all over the place. And we are very heavily reliant on third parties, both to protect our security. We're also reliant, they actually present a significant risk to us as well, because we're the nature of the connections we have with third parties. So it's much harder to go back to the question that Dan was asking about, are we secure? Or indeed, how secure are we? We don't just have to look at our own systems. We have to look at those of our big business partners and organizations that provide service to us to make sure that their cyber resilience is up to the standard that we expect.
Yeah, completely agree, Simon. And this is why it gets so interesting, because I suppose if we look at the traditional, where we were from a traditional point of view, we're traditionally towered. There are contracts out there from the old outsourcing world which are towered and have SLAs on them. I had one conversation with I have two types of CISO. One that CISO goes, yeah, give it all to me, I can do all the recovery as well. And another that says, it always happens, doesn't it? The phone rings when you're actually working at home. So listen, I'm going to go on mute. Simon, you carry on talking more. That I can't turn it off. So carry on talking.
Okay, right. So yeah, so it's a big part of it is to understand which bits we have direct control over and where we have to cede control to third parties and what we do about that. So we end up spending a lot of time. The due diligence has become really important for some of the business partners that we work with. So if I think back to 15 years ago, an organisation like ours probably might have outsourced printing, but very little else. We outsource so much now. Our WAN is obviously outsourced to a third party. We rely very heavily on AWS, Azure, Microsoft 365. We get services from Google, ServiceNow, Workday, and we are reliant on all of those organisations to protect our data. So they all have access to aspects of our systems or aspects of our data, and we are reliant on them not just from a security perspective, but also from an operational resilience and continuing to deliver the service perspective. And we're a regulated entity, so we are bound by our relationship with the Financial Conduct Authority to carry on giving services. So in our case, it's not just a loss of revenue. If our systems aren't available, then we aren't able to service our customers, and we're in breach of our regulatory obligations as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And what's really, really interesting is when I lived through the outsourcing bubble, and the closer you got to contract, the less the techies were in the room and the more the lawyers and the procurement team were in the room. And they'd negotiate procurement contracts on how cheap they can run the network or what benefit they get. But if you think about business risk appetite, I need my services back up and running in 5 minutes. Looking at the SLAs underneath it has zero correlation to the risk that you're prepared to have any appetite for. So we're finding that when we speak to companies, not only do they say, I don't know how long it would take me to get up, we're actually right down to the grassroots of, I don't even know how many SaaS solutions I've got in my environment, Flick, because I have X amount of stuff that RT's bought, but HR's got a SaaS portal and somebody else has got a SaaS portal. And actually, when we say, what is the infrastructure and everything that you've got within your realm, the answer is I don't know. And actually, my contracts and my suppliers do some of it, and I've got assets, but I haven't got a full working CMDB. So to be able to try and put control around it, to say this is the risk that I'm sitting on and the time it takes me to recover on any point, is very, very interesting now. So thank you.
You do make an interesting point about risk appetite as well, actually, about how clearly that's defined, because it's quite a difficult conversation to have with the board to say, what's your appetite type, for example, for a cyber incident? Well, not. Well, that has implications. If you are prepared to spend all the money we've got, then I can do my best to reduce it to as close to none as possible.
Yes.
And exactly the same argument comes with resilience, all aspects of resilience. It takes lots of planning and preparation, and that stuff doesn't come cheap. So there is a balance to be struck between the sort of measures you take and the cost of actually implementing them.
Right, let's carry on talking about resilience, and maybe to pick someone, Lee, we were having a debate around the importance of making sure you understand what you've got so you know how to recover. What's your view on where the world is now, not specifically to your company, but what you see, and working with lots of other colleagues, what do you see as to the ability for companies to understand what they need to recover and what risk they're sitting on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think we alluded to it earlier on, is we need to get to a model of, we talk about things like high availability, DR, BCP, that sort of stuff. But going back to my days in defence, we used to follow a model of PACE, which was primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. So essentially that if you went into a business continuity state, so give my business an example, we've got several brands and several websites, whilst we're still going to get to an RPO and RTO state, so to speak, we could still declare ourselves in an emergency state. What that would look like from a contingency planning perspective is that we could be trading through just one title, for example, as the business got appetite to do that. So I think there's lots of education that needs to go on in terms of business understanding the digital requirements to run business functions and the criticality of those assets and what that actually means. If we have an outage in a certain area or an impact in a certain area, what is the sort of material impact to the business and trading, so to speak. And then I feel like what we're trying to do in a cybersecurity sense, because however anyone's ever looked at it, cybersecurity has been to provide resilience. It's been there to protect the environment, so to speak, right? So I feel like modern day CISOs and security professionals now are almost being the glue in terms of galvanizing the different IT functions to if we look at technology teams and architectural design principles, to bake in those requirements from the very start, to make it available, to make it resilient, and right through to recover it. We may not have always been involved in terms of doing backups, but if I go back to that PACE model I just described, it's all well and good having a backup, but what are we restoring it into? What state will it be restored? And then I think there's a responsibility for us then translating that to the board to say, yes, we've got the backups, but actually what that means in terms of a business performance sense when we've restored, or what state that restoration will look like. That's the challenge, really, I suppose. So from my perspective, it is almost trying to be that voice for the wider IT function to galvanize all the different areas that make up IT in the digital ecosystem, to then paint positive picture for the business that will say, well, if the worst does happen, and I'm telling you that it probably will do, this will be the condition we will find ourselves in for this period of time. And that sort of translation really resonates with the board. They can tangibly see and feel something there. And I think that's the biggest challenge really for the security professionals moving forward. Interpersonal skills.
Oh, without a doubt. And it seems to be you need to be a charm offensive, and you also need to be in the language the board understands, which is your business will be down for 17 hours minimum and it's going to cost you this much. That's a real simple message to the board. Yeah. And you're right, it's multiple skills to try and get everybody on board and actually understanding the implication of outage or damage. So yeah, it's a very sensible way to focus on it, to be honestly.
Sensible, so not easy though.
Not easy in any way. And Simon, what's your view on that?
I think that one of the big challenges a lot of organisations face is actually being clear on what are the critical services that are delivered to customers and what it is that actually underpins those. So doing the mapping from, you've got your customer, what services do you give them, what is the minimum you need to have running to get those are operational, and what are the, go back to the point that Raj was saying, what's this server do? The other way around, saying we know we've got the service, what servers do it? So it's important that you map clearly the services you deliver to your customers onto the IT services you deliver, and then the operational hardware that underpins those. And a lot of organisations aren't really clear about that. And certainly one of the biggest use that you tend to have is one that you've got one system goes down. It's usually pretty easy to bring that back up. If you have a major outage, I had to deal with a sudden power failure once. It was literal, the whole power went to the data centre. That meant we had to decide how to prioritise all the systems to bring them back. Now, if you're going to ask a bunch of senior people what's the most important bit, well, my bit's the most important. So we have gone through an exercise, and they all said that. So we had been through an exercise before that, which was pretty challenging, but did work, to get people to say, what is the most important process, we as a business, and then let's think about the most important process we've got, how we support those, and make sure we prioritise them appropriately. But some of that is down to the relationship with the business and herding cats and trying to get them to say, actually, Sally's bit is more important than my bit in a crisis. But that's not always an easy thing to do.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because, you've got a finance pop up and say, well, I've got to make sure I declare my finances, and, and listening to the big attacks of WannaCry and NotPetya really had some fantastic examples of nobody knowing quite what bit needs to bounce up first, which ended up being quite irrelevant because it was what is capable of being bounced up first rather than what do we need to bounce up first, and not knowing the mapping of infrastructure and applications that part of the company is even using. So thank you, Simon. Now, Raj, over to you, if I may. Now, you're going to give us a 10-minute view on what you see. So what exactly does resilience mean, and the perspective of what happens when a major breach actually occurs, and how exactly do you respond when your core business is held hostage? So, Raj, let me hand over the mic to you, as they say. Very interested at this part, so to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. So I don't want to use PowerPoint. Honestly, I think what I want to try to do is maybe share with you the reality of what actually occurs, and effectively some of the real life cases that me or certainly my team have actually witnessed. And if I try to think about why resilience is one of the topics that we effectively are discussing so much today, I think in part because, this year, 2020, every company that have historically said, well, we're not a bank, we're an IT company, or we're not a retailer, we're an IT company, actually have had to actually become truly an IT company. The ability for organizations to become completely digital this year has been utterly remarkable. And, it's done against this backdrop of threat actors that, quite frankly, have become a darn sight better than what they've ever done. And, if you'll bear with me, I want to just maybe go back to 2016. And, there was a ransomware crew called GandCrab, and they were particularly successful. And why they got my attention early doors was they they had a command and control infrastructure called No More Ransom. It was nomoreransom.bit. It was a malicious infrastructure that they used to host criminal infrastructure. And, you know, obviously they were taunting us because we have nomoreransom.org. And this is a website that we've created with multiple law enforcement agencies across the world. So they got my attention very quickly. But what was really interesting about this group was they began this, I guess, cybercrime ecosystem. So they went out and they started to hire affiliates. In other words, like franchisees, as it were. And by doing so, they became really successful in not just sending emails and encrypting data, but breaking into organizations. And this is a really crucial part because at around about this time, the average payment for ransomware was at around about $200 to $300. Today, we see ransom demands of about 10 to 15 million. And of course, the ransom demand is just the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot of additional costs that are associated with it. Now, this particular crew retired in 2019, having claimed to make $2 billion in revenue. But the truth of the matter is that what they did was bigger than this because they effectively really changed the way cybersecurity and threat actors operate. What they did was they developed this affiliate scheme, which is now being copied by many actors all across the world. And in fact, they've got so good at it that, you know, historically, cybersecurity have these three disciplines of protect, detect, and correct. You know, we protect what we can, whatever gets through, we'll detect it. And anything that we try to, anything that we couldn't detect in time, we will, you know, we will correct that. But the challenge has become now that a lot of these threat actors, and especially I think on the back of what we've seen with GandCrab, their dwell time, in other words, the time that they take from getting inside your environment to actually encrypting data, used to be weeks, in fact, months even. Most recently, the Riot Gang have reduced that to 5 hours. Now, I'll be brutally honest, it takes me longer to decide what to wear than it would for them to encrypt data. But here we're dealing with adversaries that have got some of the best affiliates that can get inside environments, that can learn about the way that a company works and encrypt data in 5 hours. Now, the best SOCs in the world, I would argue, would struggle to detect, understand, and implement mitigated controls to reduce or limit the damage within 5 hours. I mean, you know, we can look at many cases over the last 3 to 4 years. Many SOCs have missed alerts going back days. And so 5 hours has fundamentally changed the way that things have occurred. And so, and of course, I realize I'm talking about ransomware, but I think it's very intentional because the reason I think we talk about resilience so much is because digital extortion has fundamentally shifted and changed. But of course, it's not just ransomware. You know, and I know Simon was talking about WAN infrastructure, but, you know, the growth of extortion using DDoS as a vehicle to target. I mean, 1 terabit attacks. If I'd have told you about 1 terabit attacks 5 years ago, you'd have called me crazy, and yet that's the norm. And it's the norm because the wider ecosystem is fueling cybercrime. The wider ecosystem is making them better, more efficient. And we have to start looking and considering, and I know this is going to seem ridiculous, we have to start considering the fact that we're not going to get the time to be able to detect. We have to make the assertion that perhaps we'll be in a scenario in which criminals are buying credentials online, they're hiring adversaries to get in, and they're implementing encryption within hours. And so all of a sudden now, our ability to be able to, or really the need to focus on this correct component becomes critical. Now, of course, that's the technical view, and that's the kind of real life view. And, you know, I've sat in a multitude of investigations in which, you know, as I said earlier, people have asked me in the middle of, you know, a firefight around us, like, well, you know, are the bad guys in our cloud infrastructure? Oh, how can we tell? Or what do we host there? Like, by then it's too late. But for me, this is a bigger issue than, oh, it's a bigger issue. For me, this is a huge issue. This is the survival of a company. But also, and I might sound melodramatic here, but Flick, when you mentioned to me the hiring of these chief resilience officers, like a shiver went down my spine, because all of a sudden I realized we're now going to be hiring, or companies are going to be hiring individuals to effectively run the risk component of a business. And that's not going to be the responsibility of the CISO. And I hope everybody that's dialed into this take notes, and copious amounts of notes, because it is utterly imperative that the CISO and the cybersecurity function begins to change and adapt the way that we communicate with the board and with senior leadership. Because if we don't, and I cannot stress this enough, if we don't, you will have a CTO and a CRO on the board, and that won't be the chief technology officer or the chief resilience officer. That will be a chief trust officer, and that will be a chief resilience officer. And so,
yeah, interesting one, because of course there's a resilience lead. I've got to make sure fire, flood, pandemic and cyber attacks are looked after to make sure the business can continue to function. So security, if I'm being a bit slightly polarizing, Raj, is that I have to make sure I've got risk of all the things. I've got to make sure I cover the risk of a workforce that maybe 20% will be either out with COVID-19 or out grieving for family or looking after different family dynamics. So I have to look at that kind of risk profile as well as outages or disruptive cyber attacks. So hence probably that's where the chief resilience officer is coming in, which is what's the real risk of my business of all attack vectors.
Yeah, but I think we have a CSO, not just a CISO, and the CSO will have overview around the physical security as well. And so there is this kind of, well, the reality is that the board is being remade up as we speak. We're getting new roles and new people on that board. It's important for the CSO and the CISO to be absolutely part of that journey rather than being told who your new boss is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Raj.
So for me, we often talk about this concept of resilience, and I know, you and I have discussed this, but for me, this is absolutely central to what the business is and what the business does. For me, this goes beyond just, okay, well, what's my minimal viable company? But it's taking in all of these environmental pressures, from understanding and adapting the way that adversaries are working, from thinking about things such as the pandemic and the impact that may have. So it's utterly imperative for me that, this discussion really should be the springboard, not only for all of us here, but for the people attending this talk, to start learning and understanding the way that our industry is going to go, and quite frankly, their careers. I mean, this literally is their careers, and I've not seen such a fundamental shift in the way of thinking of businesses with regards to cyber before. So,
yeah, it's very interesting, Raj. I'm seeing a definite shift of where CIOs are looking at wanting services now rather than tools, and wanting some kind of ratification that they're getting a cyber resilience service, or ratification of that kind of structured control, rather than let me have a tool to do what, some of it is commodity security, commodity resilience. So it's not, used to be look after my backup. Now it's, can you make sure I've got full data protection so I can scratch and burn and reburn the servers with clean data should I need to. So definite different questions coming out from a CIO perspective.
Yeah, sorry, and I was just going to add to that. And of course, we have to remember that the bad guys are becoming more destructive. So this is not like a fire and forget. This is not a, okay, we're resilient now, when's the Christmas party? It's actually, now we're seeing, master boot record wipes. So effectively, they're not just wiping systems, they're putting them back to bare metal. So it's important for that certainly that cyber component, to be up to date with what's going on and how the threat actors are adapting and evolving.
Yeah, Raj, I couldn't agree with you more. What I'm seeing over the last few months of companies phoning up, and I get to hear ones that don't hit the press as well, same as you, I'm sure, is they suddenly say, well, I've got nothing left, I can't switch anything on, and then realize that they've got no ability to recover. In fact, I did a simulation with a retail company abroad, and it was within 20 minutes of me asking them questions, they realized it'd be an 8-week rebuild and they would never get their data back, and they'd never considered that before. So yes, it's and they're going to get the hackers and the state-sponsored destructive attacks are going to get more and more sophisticated, and how do you keep on top of them? And that's a very interesting question I'd like to ask all of you is, what do you think the outcome will be? Do you think it will be something that I believe, which will be scratch and burn? As soon as you find a hiccup, you just wipe the server and burn it back down again? Or do you think there's other approaches? So maybe first of all, can I go to Dan and ask you what you think the future is going to hold?
I guess, yeah, good question. I mean, I think it could be both. It'll depend on the scenario, but I could well imagine, scenarios where scratch and burn is going to be your best option. I mean, the challenge in my head is always, and you've already alluded to it, is once the threat's in there, even if you have a recovery route, how can you be confident that you're recovering clean, that you're not going to reintroduce the infection or the threat into that environment? And in that scenario, scratch and burn could be your only option. If your backups are compromised, then that may well be your only route to recovery. So, if you're lucky, you'll be able to restore the lot. But yeah, I think it could be both.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. And Lee, what's your view?
I think for myself, I'm more of a believer in an agile approach. So we should be comfortable with a burn down and a restore quite quickly and quite efficiently and effectively. Just realistically, we're not. No one's there yet, are they? That's the plain truth. I think for me, we're probably suffering a hangover from too many years of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Whereas we should be, we've got enough factual evidence around us to demonstrate the prevalence and the risk of all of this. And I think for me, success in our industry will be measured not on the event not happening or preventing the event from not happening, but the success will be measured on how less of an impact it's had on us. So for me, as a cyber professional, your biggest fear is really that ransomware attack tearing through the network. But success should be not deemed on did we or did we not get ransomware. It should be we got ransomware, but we were still 20, 30, 40% operational whilst we're doing the cleanup operation. And I think it's that shift in mindset of just getting to the facts and then building around the facts.
Yeah, I totally agree, Lee. And it's really interesting. I spoke to a security consultant the other day, and I said, "What's the first step you do if there was a bare metal outage, total wipeout to master boot record?" And he said, "I'd hire a lawyer." And I said, "Okay, job number 2." He said, "Do forensics once it's all back up." And I said, "What about the recovery of the company? Because by then the company's gone bust." And he said, "Nah, not my job." And that's where we're all converging, because of course it's no longer just security, it's actually IT.
That's where Cyber mentioned it earlier about risk appetite, right? So this is where it's that conversation and that synergy between the board and the understanding from the board of the level of risk they're sitting at. The risk appetite is not determined by the professional in the chair who's holding that grenade. That's the business saying we've got low, medium, high, whatever it may be, appetite to that. And us as professionals doing a quantifiable assessment of that and overlaying it and go, well, actually, you're outside of your own appetite, so therefore this is what we need to do. So he's putting the onus on the people who have the power to make the changes.
It is, because if you go to a board and say, by the way, your RPO and RTO is 17 hours, are you okay with that? And the answer is no, I want to be back up and running in 5 minutes. You've got a real, again, it goes charm offensive to say, well, I need this much to get it to 5 minutes. But of course, historically, I can see why. All these contracts are negotiated with procurement, and they've done network, and then they've done the apps, and then they've done the cloud, and then they've negotiated the infrastructure, all different SLAs depending on what offerings. But actually, that all builds up to your business risk appetite versus your IT risk stance. And I see, bring me up in 5 minutes, Flick, peel off the layers of SLAs around the mainframe and the database restores, you're talking 33 hours. And that's if everything's good, let alone You've got dirty
You hit a
data.
really interesting point, Flick, because as businesses everywhere digitalize more, then the likelihood of this is increasing. Never mind the external stuff that's going on, which is growing, as Raj explained, exponentially. As the business does digitalizes more, it has got more of a dependency on a cyber professional to ensure the security and availability of those services that the business is so reliant upon. So I think it's just this graph at the minute that is just the importance of what we're talking about is just increasing day by day.
Absolutely. And we're going to go to questions now, if I may. And I've got a really interesting question from Hadeline. She says, needing her glasses. And it's really quite interesting. Apart from creating a cyber vault, are there any other cyber resilient alternatives out there in the marketplace? Now, not that I'm going to go and do a product sale, because I don't like talking about products, but the net of it is yes, take the data, lock it away, clean the data, do anomaly detection, preferably rule-based anomaly detection, not signature-based, because then you pick up that your data has a temperature and a sore throat rather than, oh, yes, here's COVID-19. And then, of course, lock it away. And that's part of the story. But it's the orchestration back of that service into the business to make sure you can recover at the speed, because you might just vault the data. And then when you go, right, everything bad has happened, how do I now restore? And the answer is, oh, it's a 4-day restore, because we've got to get it out of the vault, we've got to rebuild it. So there's lots of other alternatives out there. Specifically from IBM, I'm totally tech agnostic, so I work with every cloud provider, I work with every technology. I even found a VAX VMS that was 31 years old the other day. So Hadeline, I think there's lots of solutions out there, but they provide the same concept, which is take the data, clean the data, vault the data, orchestrate it back up at the RTO and RPO the business is prepared to tolerate. Now, let me ask Raj and Simon a question, because Dan and Lee, I've been asking you lots of questions. So let's ask Raj and Simon. Raj, first of all, have you seen any changes in the way the board has had discussions around the topic of resilience over the last few months?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say, certainly not over the last couple of months. I think, focus has been with regards to just maintaining the business, clearly. Certainly the focus of cyber is definitely either number one or number two on the board agenda, and that's something that's really been there for I guess for a couple of years. What's fundamentally shifting and changing, however, and I was talking to a CISO for a large bank, and he says to me, of all the people that brief the board, I'm here the most. And so what's interesting is that cyber is definitely seen as a key risk. Broadly, resilience is becoming a discussion topic, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's there all of the time. But what's interesting for me is, yes, it's a key topic. Yes, it's a key risk. Number two, it's not actually seen as an enabler yet. So it's really seen from the risk perspective. And perhaps more concerning is we're not seeing either cyber or resilience kind of professionals actually being either promoted as CEOs or CIOs or CTOs yet. So I think it's definitely a topic of concern, but for it to be kind of into the culture of the way the business operates, I think we've probably got some time to go.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Raj. I think we do have a place to go, and it really is quite interesting that cyber resilience is now the new sexy, let's say, or resilient business is one of the new top 2021 technology trends. So I'm really pleased to see that resilience is back, because I don't know if any of you have seen the IT crowd, but I am likened a lot to Jen out of the IT crowd that's kept in the basement and a bit dusty. And the first thing that gets cut when budgets get a little bit constrained and people don't need backup and DR. And actually what we're now seeing, as my CEO said, was actually if you do a traditional or legacy security approach, it just runs you off a cliff 10 minutes later. So you need to know, of course, that if you do go down, how quickly it's going to take you to get back up, if, of course, you can get back up. So thank you, Raj. Simon, one for you. Now, how have you helped organizations undertake security and resilience initiatives whilst navigating budget constraint? Because, of course, like the CIO of a bank said to me last week, Flick, when there's risk, I've always got money. But, of course, budget constraints, when you start saying, boss, I want to orchestrate my DR, is, no way, I haven't got money for that. So what do you think is letting the money flow in terms of budget, and what is not being spent in terms of budget at the moment, Simon, from what you see?
So I think a big part of this is down to the point I made earlier on about risk appetites, because clearly if you're going to say we don't have a risk appetite for doing such and such, so at Morrison's, we did literally have no risk appetite for poisoning our customers. You just cannot let that happen. So we were prepared to spend pretty much anything that it required. Now, fortunately, that was relatively cheap. Security isn't. So getting that right does require striking a balance there. But being absolutely explicit about the risk, I think, is really important, and making sure that risks are clearly identified, but then that flows upwards as well, so that's presented clearly to the board. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the likelihood of a security person getting in front of the board was just about nil. Certainly when I started my career, it just didn't happen. I do talk to our board very regularly. So, just as Raj was saying, I am there just as a routine these days. So we have a risk committee, which I attend every single time. I talk about cyber risk at every single risk meeting we have. So I think the board is absolutely aware of that. And I think back in the day when security was just seen as a sort of hygiene factor, I think certainly the boards I've worked with recently are much clearer about how complex this is, how the challenge is evolving all the time. And, back to the point Raj made about fire and forget, this is something that, you give it another few weeks and there will be a new challenge. There'll be a new issue arising all the time. Yeah. And I think if you engage well with the board and steer clear of sort of technical talk, but focus very much on the outcomes that the board is interested in, such as continuing to give appropriate service to our customers, avoiding unnecessary spend and so on, that is something that will resonate with them. So I think a lot of it is really about prioritization. So when you're trying to explain about why it's appropriate to have an appropriate identity and access management system, it's sort of quite dry, and it's really important that if you communicate that appropriately as to how that will affect business outcomes, it's much easier to get activities like that prioritized against things that may actually be income generating. So I think that conversation is a lot easier than it used to be. I think the other thing is we've talked a lot about a sort of cyber disaster, but there are other things that can affect the delivery of service. So we think of a complete power outage, but you can have brownouts and issues arise with degradations of service as well. And I think that's something that has been high in our board's mind with the pandemic. We had to make a very quick move to providing service with everybody working at home. And for people like me, that's relatively straightforward. We weren't really set up for mobile working, and we had to, in the space of a few weeks, get used to that. And maintaining the service to our customers is a really big part of that. So when it comes to something like that, it's not a difficult conversation to have with your CEO. Is you give us that money to do something, and we will have the service running pretty much at the pre-COVID levels in a couple of weeks. So I think it's getting that back into clear business terms and trying to steer clear of a sort of very inward-looking, purely security focus when you're talking to the board.
I couldn't agree with you more, Simon. And the boards are starting to get a little bit more aware, but we still see that they're assuming the technology will just run and not have this correlation of when IT's down, revenue stops, and also, of course, brand and reputation, and even worse, human impact of outage. So it's really essential we take this seriously. So, Raj, one last question for you. Over the next 5 to 10 years, where do you think cybersecurity is going to go? And of course, resilience going to go? And how do you see it all converging into operational resilience, which is why we're here today to talk about real operational resilience?
Well, I think the answer to that is dependent on you. It's dependent upon Dan and Lee and Simon and, the attendees, because in my mind, actually, Dan said a great point earlier. I always say cybersecurity is the one area that can never give a straight answer. Yeah. What was your ROI? Are we secure? Maybe. Yeah. Were we hit by that particular attack? Probably. We can never answer a question, yes or no. And I think that level of uncertainty has created a sense of distance or frustration with the business. You go to the marketing department, they can give you the number of leads that they got, They can even do some magic to tell you how much money, their investment has returned to the business. For us, I'm yet to meet somebody that can give me a case study that demonstrates the return on investment from antivirus software. So I think a lot of this really depends upon us, and fundamentally, it's going to require and demand a new approach from us as security professionals. Our ability to be able to have that engagement, but not only have that engagement, but to begin to have that discussion with the business to understand what is that minimum viable business. And I love that term that you've come back with. And back to that point about cyber vaults, this is not a new approach. I mean, in industrial control system environments, in ICS environments, they had security zones. So in other words, you had the operational technology, which was totally segmented from the IT network. We'll begin to see that type of approach coming out again. Whether the security or whether the cyber component is going to be the one driving that depends upon us. If we want to sit down, and I think what scared me was when you said earlier, you speak to CISOs who say, not my problem. But you know what? If it's not your problem, don't worry about it. You'll be reporting to them in 3 to 5 years' time. They'll take away the C title from your job, and you can now be the director of security. That's fine if that's what you want, but be absolutely sure this is what businesses are demanding, and they're demanding this because the environment and the world has fundamentally shifted and changed. The bad guys have got better. The pandemic is here. Everybody is an IT company now. So this is our opportunity, I think, to be part of that discussion. So I hope we're sitting here in a few years' time and, Dan, Lee, and Simon are all chief resilient officers or CEOs, and maybe that's the world that we live in. But I think it depends upon us.
Raj, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And we've got an interesting question come in, actually. It's Rob Lation says, what's the best operating model to prepare for a disruptive event, including cyber and rehearsal response, and who should be involved and how should it be governed? We have CISOs, resilience managers, CIOs, CTOs, COOs. Should this be driven by the COO, and do they have the awareness and capability? Now, before I pass the buck to any of you, that's a really interesting question, Rob. And actually, in truth, if I'm being really honest, with the hundreds of companies I've worked with over the last couple of years, everybody has a different approach. Everybody has a different sacrificial lamb, and everybody has a different operating model. And of course, it's all politics and land grab as well, which is why Lee was so right about the charm offensive that you need to do. So I would like to put it out to all four of you, actually. Let's look at what you believe the real operating model should be. Dan, over to you first.
I think you absolutely nailed it, Flick. There is no one size fits all. I think a key ingredient missing there that you spoke about, though, was your business, its culture, because that will ultimately influence who are the right people and the best people to be in the room as well. And it's going to involve a mixture of all those people. For me, one of the most important ingredients is to have, ideally the CEO as part of that group. And, often I found the COO can be a good substitute, someone who is absolutely empowered to make the right timely decisions for you. But it really comes down to having that plan in advance, identifying that team, documenting their roles and responsibilities, how they are going to work, and to the point made in the question, planning and rehearsing that regularly, at least annually. Put that group through its paces, make sure everybody understands the role they play. But some of the key ones for me outside of the decision maker are, your PR team. For me, we talked about that damage control element of an incident. For me, one of the absolute most important pieces of any cyber incident is how you communicate it, what you say to your customers, to your business, and your colleagues, HR, legal, security, obviously, IT. There's some pretty key ones in there, but it does all come down to what's right for your business, culturally, operationally.
Perfect. No, I think you're right, Dan. Thank you for that, without a doubt. So, Lee, what's your view on it?
I think you touched on it. A lot of this depends on the individual themselves, right? So within my organization, I've got a solid line into the CIO and I've got a dotted line into the CRO. So I've got the ear of two influential people on the board, so to speak. And then it's about being selective in finding an appropriate framework that you can handrail, that you'll be able to sell, right? So what a really good one for me is, closer to home in cyber, I'll use NIST. I'll use NIST because I feel like it will cover areas in traditionally cyber. So, detect and respond, for example. You've got an identification element of it, which firmly sits within IT in the business in terms of understanding your assets, the criticality of those assets, what services those assets underpin, so etc. and so on and so forth. You've got protect. For me, is fundamentally like more of a cultural and behavioural thing within how technology builds out these digital services. For, like Raj said, everyone is turning into a digital company now. So the understanding of sort of those principles of how we build things. It's almost like in construction, like you've got the health and safety aspect of it. We need to be baking that into the digital things that we build. And then the final element of it is recovery. So I sort of dissect those core pillars, and I'll speak to CIO about certain elements of it, and I know that these will sit more naturally within his area and have more of an impact to him. But then there's other elements of it that I'll take up to the CRO and influence him, and to say, well, look, I'm part of this operating model, and part of how we should be doing things. We're looking heavily at a recovery element, for example, and obviously there's artifacts under that pillar. So that's how I kind of skin it. But yeah, I think it just gets back down to the individual, and looping all the way back to what we said at the very start. I think you're going to see more of a precedence within a security professional's job spec in terms of being technically sound, having a high degree of business acumen as well, and having those interpersonal skills. So essentially, we're going to be looking for unicorns moving forward.
Well, you're right. That's exactly what we need, and we need to have them taken seriously, rather than, and everybody is not quite sure what CISO does, except for you protect it when all goes wrong, don't you? And you make sure it doesn't go wrong, which of course is not necessarily the case. It's a whole business issue, and even the European Central Bank Oversight Committee.
I think, like, just one final point on that, being comfortable with the accountability aspect as well. I think maybe sometimes I sit on quite a few roundtables, and you get the typical, no one's investing, we're not getting the buy-in, but it takes a lot of moral courage to stand up in an accountable position and say, this isn't as good as it should be. And I think if we're not completely honest with the communication that we're going up and out with, then how could we ever possibly get that investment downwards?
Yeah. Oh, without a doubt, Lee, completely agree with you. Simon, what's your view?
I think a lot of it does depend on the culture of the organisation. So if you're in a heavily compliance-driven organisation where there's really effective risk management, the CRO might be the right place to do it. I've certainly, as a consultant, worked in organisations that were really very strongly driven by regulatory compliance, and having something that clearly didn't meet the regulatory requirements was often quite a strong driver for budgetary change. Some organisations are either not regulated or only regulated quite lightly, and that doesn't work. So in a lot of organisations where there is a really strong focus, say, on service delivery, the COO might be the right person. So often we'll be really interested in all aspects of service delivery, whether that's something with a just degradation of service or actually complete cessation of service. But I do think that if you can get the CEO interested, then the CEO says so is normally a pretty good reason to get things done. I've worked with hundreds of organisations. I can't think of very many of them where people would say, I don't really care what the CEO says. So if you can get the CEO on side, that is a great start. And of course, the CEO fundamentally cares about the long-term success of the business. So that is a good place to start. I think the point that Ian made actually in his question about security professionals is true. It is very easy to get focused on technical detail and to be doing a load of stuff in the background that the board never sees and doesn't understand either. If you carry on operating at that level, they will never care very much about what you do. It will always be seen as a hygiene factor. Doesn't Simon go off and clean up the security stuff at night when nobody's here? Yeah, no, it's not like that. So I think it's a really cultural thing, but I think in a lot of organisations I've worked with, I would say the COO is probably the one who may not have the expertise, but would be the most appropriate sponsor. But a lot of it is really down to the culture of the organisation.
Oh, without a doubt. But you see, I speak to people that go, yeah, I've got DR. And I say, right, rewind, what is your DR? And they go, well, I do DR on 6 apps. So I found in international critical infrastructure that's got 6% of DR capacity in their DR because no one's got any money to add any more. I've got companies that really should know better, that when you say, how did you do your DR test last year? They go, well, we haven't done it for a couple of years. We weren't ready. Or even worse, they say we do DR on 6 apps and assume the 2,500 that we do use actually will fall in line. And it gets worse and worse. I've got one that said we haven't rebooted our servers since 2015. We're too worried they won't reboot. And that's a international critical infrastructure company. So you suddenly think that actually, yeah, we've got DR, move on. Yeah, we've got security, move on. And then you actually say, no, hold on a second. Can you recover from a bare metal? Can you do this? Can you do that? And the answer is, nah, not really. We do a tick box exercise, or even worse, you find the supplier who is responsible for it has been sweating their own assets and hasn't done DR either, and assumes it's all going to be okay. So anyway, that's my view. And thank you, Simon. And Raj, what's your view on that?
So this is going to be a little controversial. So I do apologize if I offend anybody. This is the CISO's role. It absolutely should be the CISO's role. And the reason is because the number one risk for every company on the planet, pandemic or not, is cyber, right? Let's not make any bones about it. This is what the biggest risk is. And the one person in the entire company that understands what the biggest risks are to an organization and what the impact to that organization will be the CISO. If the CISO doesn't do it, it's because they're either politically adept, or they're too scared and they want to hide in their bunker. That's the reality. Now, I want to tread carefully here, because resilience and cyber is the least interesting part of a CEO's day, because it doesn't make money. And so I think the CISO has to, number one, take leadership, has to become more politically adept, have to find a way to do that. And that really is the unicorn, right? But we've got to find a way to take that leadership position, but also we've got to come and present something else, because all we're simply doing is coming in and presenting bad news, like, oh, well, yeah, what if this happens, or what if that happens? And Lee mentioned FUD earlier. Like, all we do is say we need investment because what if? And so this is kind of like a little bit out there, but the CISO also now has to develop ways in which to add value to the company's bottom line. And I think that's feasible today in the world that we're moving towards. I mean, I'm going to try to lend my expertise in insurance, Simon, so please don't, but like, if you look at the way the insurance industry is changing, the implementation of black boxes, whereby we're leveraging like transactional data from consumers to provide bottom line better savings, and therefore cheaper savings, therefore driving the bottom line and getting more customers, is one way in which we're using technology and IoT to improve sectors that effectively haven't changed significantly. In Dan's world in retail, we're reading news about Debenhams and Arcadia, and yet the big retailers out there, ASOS and Boohoo and Next, now have got these digital platforms where they're developing trust over digital platforms. Developing trust in these digital systems, for me, has to be driven by the CISO. If it's not, it will be the Chief Trust Officer. And I know I mentioned about that earlier. So for me, the CISO has to change and adapt from being somebody that's just making sure that the AV is rolled out to somebody that takes that wider business view around resilience, but also is helping driving innovation. And, as a customer of everybody here, as a customer of countless different companies, I'd feel a darn sight better if it was the CISO that was driving this rapid innovation, as opposed to, what did Rob say, the CIO, the CTO, the COO. I would feel a darn sight more comfortable, because at least I know we're all technologists, but actually fundamentally we understand risk. And that's what we need to start to think about. So I think for me, it's the CISO, and it has to be the CISO. If it's not the CISO, then God help us all.
I would, true, but if I can be a little bit provocative, Raj, let's say, for example, it's a destructive 0-day attack and everything's sitting dead, nothing's working. Typically what I see at this point in time is you turn to the CISO and they go, look, I don't know how to restore, don't know how to recover. You've got to speak to your IT ops team to get it back up and running so I can do my work. So I agree with you to a degree until, of course, it either goes wrong or, from a resilience point of view, build the architecture so you know what you've got and build the resilience into it so you don't go down or can divert to a secondary skeleton environment while you're actually finding what the problem is. And so I agree with you, because you've been trained in how to do, command and control in a war zone, let's face it. But actually what we find is actually you either need IT ops feeding into the CISO, or you need IT operations side by side with the CISO to be able to work as a joint team, because there's too much in your head to be able to protect, detect, respond. Oh, and by the way, can you do a 0-day recovery for me in the right order at the right time and work with all the suppliers? So agree with you to a point, but I also agree that it's nearly always IT ops and the business demanding what they want, IT operations trying to restore, CISOs trying to say, look, we're all infected. So it is a moving feast, I think.
Can I make a point as well, Flick? In fact, Ian has more or less made my point for me in the comments. So, I obviously focus on cybersecurity, and a lot of this discussion has focused around cybersecurity. And it's interesting you mention Arcadia and Debenhams. They've not failed for anything to do with cyber. So for lots of businesses, cyber is not their top risk. There are financial risks that can be just as big. I also see poor performance, though, in businesses because of poor design and poor operations, and it's not really necessarily to do with cyber. So I've seen organisations that struggle to serve their customers because the resilience wasn't there in the design of their operations. So there are lots of other reasons why businesses can get into operational difficulties that are cyber. So cyber's important, but I think it's important that security people don't just focus on that. Perfect.
Thank you, Simon. So I think we're coming to the end. So I'm going to ask you one more provocative question. What would you say, what would all of you say, so let's say 3 words or 1 sentence, that be the first thing you would do should you actually be taken down and not be able to recover? What would be the first things that you would recommend that you do? Dan? Not to put you on the spot, my friend. I'm so sorry.
The very first thing is establish very quickly what we're getting back first. Make sure we are all very clear and in agreement. What order are we bringing back things? And secondly, to make sure we have a good comms plan in place to start talking, because for us as a retailer, if we lost everything, it's the worst case scenario. The money stops coming in, so we have to think about how we're going to reassure the customers that we're going to be back soon, and this, that we're giving the right messages out. But the very first thing has to be, what are we bringing back in what order?
Perfect, thank you, Dan. Lee, what would be your view?
I would crack open the tried and tested playbook that we have for such a scenario, and then I think that's the important thing, really. Like Dan said, we undervalue the importance of communication. I think communication is key, because in the event that you describe, there's going to be a myriad of things going on. So there needs to be a centralized command and control function that's coordinating all of this, with a lot of people around the business engaged in concurrent activity. So I think in the worst case scenario, comms is probably the priority 1 for me.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Simon, what's your view?
I've sort of been in this situation in a previous job, actually, and our first step was to go back to our business continuity plans, because there had been areas where we'd identified gaps in our DR capability. So we did have some workarounds in place for different types of failure. So that was our first place to turn. If you are, for instance, an online business and your website goes down, well, you don't have a business really. But a lot of businesses are able to have some workarounds at least. In our case, if our systems all go down, we essentially stop paying money out and stop getting money in. So it's and the paying out is an important, fundamental part of our business. So it's sort of double disaster in that case. But yeah, it's really about making sure you know what plans you've got in place to cope with the absence of IT systems, and then focus on what I hope will be already prioritised order of recovery.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. And Raj, what's your view?
Well, I think really just to kind of echo, the comments from earlier, we would have planned, we would have anticipated, and we would have rehearsed this very situation. So go back to that muscle memory, contact the key stakeholders that we need to contact, and just put into effect what we've been rehearsing and planning for.
Perfect. Raj, I think you're right. And do you know what I would say on top of that is make sure you know who's in control. Because when we find situations, we find that techies being really helpful all want to run at it. And actually, we found situations where one company's brought up their DR environment and their production environment, different data sets, and of course, actually did more damage through the damage control. So definitely have one person in command where everybody lines up behind them and say, right, what do you want me to do? And of course, the longest time I've ever seen is the point of disaster to invocation of actually, that's the bit, when do you invoke, when do you actually declare? So interesting times. Now,
sorry, can I say one more thing? And I think also, I totally forgot to mention this as well. Also, understand who your core suppliers are and the ones that you need there and then. I think Simon mentioned that earlier, but that to me is the most important thing. And, making that phone call to provider X or provider Y, having those secondary or tertiary contacts that you know who to contact in the event that your primary is away on vacation. So make sure you have that in your kind of in case of emergency break here seal, because you're going to need them.
Yeah, and Raj, the thing is, if there was a massive cyber attack, how many companies do you think IBM could run at before we run out of resource? And also, I've heard some nightmare stories where they said, sorry, no, can't help you, it's force majeure, act of war, goodbye. And then when they said, well, raise a purchase order, they said, how do you expect us to raise a purchase order? We got nothing, no systems. Or the DR plan is on the computer, which is also good. So you're absolutely right, Raj. So couldn't agree more. But suppliers, of course, some suppliers are good and just run at it, like IBM. We all run at it until it's fixed. But other suppliers will be, well, I'm only contracted to get the green light flashing, and it's flashing, so we're done, which, of course, doesn't bring back companies. So, gentlemen, I'm going to do a wrap here. Thank you so much for all your time. I know that we didn't have the wonderful Cybergeddon video. We will make sure it's posted online for everybody that's attended. I know, Raj, you've seen it as well. And but thank you so much. It's been a really interactive discussion. So any final comments from any of you, or shall we call it a wrap?
I did have just one, actually. I meant to say earlier on, was about rehearsal.
Yeah.
If you aren't sure how to do it, try it and see what goes wrong. That might help you answer the question as to whether the coup or the CRO is the right person. And it's a great way of identifying. No matter how much you plan, a realistic exercise will tell you things you did not know before.
Oh, without a doubt. And now they're saying, don't do one a year, do one every quarter or even two a quarter, so that we all remember. And like Raj said, muscle memory, think, prepare, rehearse, but one a year. To do a DR test where you stepped out of role, done 8 weeks prep, and then pressed the button and gone, phew, right, signed off, done, is absolutely the wrong way. So couldn't agree with you, Simon and Raj.
I think the muscle memory is key for this, because in the event of a crisis, the best laid
get telephone book out
the window. So,
it is just muscle memory that sticks. And of course, when you're trying to work out who your suppliers are and they're in the procurement team and it's in a database, or even worse, just like NotPetya, your phone system's gone down as well. And of course, when computers go down, one company said, right, we've got a list of the top 40 execs we've got to contact in a disaster. It was on the computer. So it was all down to personal, who's got the WhatsApp, who's got the phone number of the boss, who's got the phone number of this. So yeah, absolutely agree. Perfect. Right. I will say thank you extremely. Oh, that's not even good English. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Really enjoyed today.